On a quiet August evening in 1986, in the hills of northwestern Cameroon, the villages around Lake Nyos settled into the familiar rhythms of rural life. The sun dipped behind the ridges of the Oku volcanic highlands, and the crater lake itself, dark and seemingly peaceful, reflected the last light of day. The villages of Nyos, Cha, Subum, Fang, and Mashi went about their evening routines. Children finished chores, cooking fires were lit, and families ate their meals, unaware that the lake in their backyard was storing a disaster unlike anything they, or the modern world, had ever seen. Lake Nyos did not look dangerous. It was a small, remote crater lake, about 1,900 meters long and roughly 200 meters deep, nestled in a volcanic caldera within the broader Oku volcanic field. Narrow, winding roads led to scattered villages of subsistence farmers and herders who depended on the fertile soils and rain of the highlands. The lake provided water for people and animals, fish for those who lived near its shores, and a scenic backdrop to everyday life. To most residents, it was simply there, a permanent feature of the landscape that had always been part of the world and always would be. What no one could see was what lay beneath the surface. Far below the calm blue water, Lake Nyos was quietly absorbing carbon dioxide gas that seeped upward from magma deep in the earth. Over years, and likely decades, that gas dissolved into the cold, dense bottom waters of the lake, forming a deep layer saturated with CO2 under high pressure. Above it, warmer, less dense water floated in a stable layer, so the lake did not mix from top to bottom the way many lakes do in temperate regions. To the eye, nothing seemed unusual, but in scientific terms, Lake Nyos had become a loaded gun, a stratified system filled with gas that needed only the right trigger to erupt. The people living around Nyos knew nothing about limnology or volcanic gas. Their concerns were practical and immediate: crops, cattle, school fees, and rough roads. The hills and the lake were part of their identity and livelihoods, not objects of scientific study. Some elders talked about spirits in the water or strange smells from the lake at times, but such tales fit into older beliefs about ancestors and the invisible world. No one imagined that the lake itself could one night turn into a silent killer. On the night of August 21st, 1986, the weather was unremarkable. Around 9 or 10 in the evening, people in the valleys near Lake Nyos heard what some described as a deep rumbling noise, like distant thunder or a low explosion. Those closest to the lake later recalled a bubbling, roaring sound, as if the water itself were boiling. A white or grayish cloud rose from the lake's surface, towering perhaps hundreds of meters into the air, before spilling over the crater's rim and flowing down the valleys. At first, some villagers may have thought it was ordinary fog or smoke, since the hills often held mist at night. But this cloud moved with unnatural purpose, hugging the ground and rolling silently toward the villages. Inside the homes and compounds scattered along the valley floors, people were getting ready for bed. In the village of Nyos itself, farmers lay down on mats and beds. Children drifted off to sleep. Cattle were tethered, and dogs curled up in the dust. A man named Papa Subum went to bed in his house with his wife and children, with no reason to expect anything other than another early morning of work. A 6-year-old boy named Yusuf Musa, living in another settlement, was too young to understand the strange smell that some people noticed in the air, a mix of rotten eggs and gunpowder, as one man later described it. What came next was swift and invisible. The white cloud pouring out of Lake Nyos was actually carbon dioxide, a colorless, odorless, heavier-than-air gas that in high concentrations can displace oxygen and suffocate any living thing that breathes it. Estimates suggest that somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000 tons of CO2, suddenly erupted from the lake, forming a dense blanket called a mazuku, a killer cloud that spilled down the slopes at speeds that may have reached tens of kilometers per hour. The gas stayed close to the ground, sliding along the contours of the valleys, filling houses, huts, and low-lying areas as it went. People and animals caught in its path simply collapsed where they were, with no time to run, no warning that they were breathing air with almost no oxygen left in it. In Nyos, Chea, Subum, and nearby villages, entire families died in their sleep or fell unconscious mid-stride. The weird smell that some remembered may have been faint traces of other volcanic gases or the effect of CO2 on their senses, but the main killer left no visible mark in the air. Cattle, goats, and chickens dropped dead in their pens. Wild animals, insects, and birds also perished. So survivors later spoke of a terrible silence, with no chirping or buzzing, as if the world itself had paused. Those who lived on slightly higher ground or in places where the cloud passed beneath them sometimes lost consciousness for hours, and then woke to a transformed landscape. Many of the roughly 5,000 people who ultimately survived did so because they were just above the worst parts of the gas flow. One survivor later wrote that his story was a riddle that left listeners wondering why he had lived when so many others had not. He described going to sleep one ordinary night and waking up surrounded by bodies and silence, with no idea what had happened during the hours he had been unconscious. In interviews decades later, men and women recalled waking to find loved ones dead beside them, children on the floor, parents motionless, without any sign of injury or struggle. Many of the dead showed no external trauma at all. They looked as if they had simply laid their heads down and passed away. The horror came from the scale, not the appearance, the sheer number of motionless bodies in houses, in fields, and along roads. When dawn broke on August 22, 1986, those who had survived began to take in what had happened. A villager named Gilbert Kima remembered hearing big rocks falling near the lake during the night and smelling a terrible mixture of gunpowder and rotten eggs. By morning, the smell had faded, but the shock remained. Many people who woke were weak, dizzy, and disoriented, having inhaled enough CO2 to damage their bodies, but not enough to kill them outright. They stumbled through their villages, calling out for relatives and neighbors, only to discover that most would never answer. As one survivor put it, Lake Nyos, which had given us life, had become our worst enemy. The first outsiders to arrive were local officials, soldiers, and aid workers from other parts of Cameroon who had heard rumors of a strange calamity in the northwest. Roads into the region were poor, and it took time to get trucks and medical teams to the affected area. When they reached the valley, they described scenes that looked like something from a horror film. Villages full of corpses, animals lying dead in the fields, and a lake that had changed a color from blue to a reddish-brown, stained by disturbed sediments and organic matter brought to the surface. The air was eerily still and quiet, with almost no signs of living birds or insects. Emergency responders had to work carefully, unsure at first whether the air near the lake was still dangerous. Some wore masks and carried oxygen. Others moved by trial and error, watching for signs of dizziness or shortness of breath as they approached low-lying areas. Many of the dead had to be buried quickly in mass graves, both because of the tropical heat and because there were simply too many bodies for individual funerals. Families who had lost almost everyone were left to grieve, while also struggling to comprehend what had killed their loved ones without leaving burns, wounds, or visible marks. The death toll was staggering for such a remote place. Estimates vary, but most sources agree that around 1,700 to 1,800 people died within about 25 kilometers of the lake, along with some 3,500 head of livestock. Some accounts put the human toll closer to 2,000, when including those who died in the days after from complications and injuries. Entire villages, such as Nyos and Cha, lost the majority of their inhabitants in a single night. In the broader region, more than 10,000 survivors were evacuated and had to be resettled in camps or in newly built communities far from the lake. It was, by any measure, the worst natural disaster in modern West African history, and one of the strangest geological catastrophes ever recorded. Scientists from Cameroon, France, the United States, and other countries quickly realized that they were dealing with an extremely rare phenomenon. Just 2 years earlier, in 1984, another crater lake in Cameroon, Lake Manoon, about 100 kilometers to the south, had experienced a smaller but similar event that killed 37 people when a bubble of CO2 gas erupted from its depths. That incident had raised questions among volcanologists, but Lake Nyos piled urgency onto those concerns. Teams arrived with instruments to measure gas levels, temperature profiles, and water chemistry, trying to understand how a lake could suddenly turn lethal on such a massive scale. Their investigations confirmed the broad outlines of what had happened. Over many years, carbon dioxide from magma beneath the Oku volcanic field had seeped into Lake Nyos, dissolving in the cold water at depth and accumulating as a dense, gas-rich layer beneath the warmer surface waters. Because the lake lay in the tropics and was protected by steep crater walls, it did not undergo the regular seasonal overturns that mix and ventilate many lakes in temperate regions. As a result, the deep waters became increasingly saturated with CO2, like a bottle of soda slowly being pressurized. At some point, the system crossed a tipping point. A modest disturbance, perhaps a landslide, a small earthquake, heavy rain, or even internal instability in the stratified water, allowed gas bubbles to begin rising from the depths. Once those bubbles formed, they reduced the density of the water around them, causing more gas-rich water to rise and decompress, releasing even more CO2 in a chain reaction. In minutes or hours, a towering column of gas-loaded water shot upward, degassing violently at the surface and sending that deadly cloud cascading down the slopes. At the same time, the physical displacement of water in the lake produced waves up to dozens of meters high, which scoured the shores and knocked down vegetation near the waterline. When scientists sampled the lake after the disaster, they found that the deep water had been partially stripped of its gas and that the entire lake had turned a uniform, cooler temperature, consistent with a massive mixing event. The existence of another crater lake, Monoon, with similar features and its earlier, smaller disaster, suggested that Nyos was not a freak one-off, but part of a broader, if rare, category of hazards now known as limnic eruptions. Around the world, only a few lakes have the right combination of depth, volcanic gas input, and stratification to pose such a threat. But for the people living around Nyos and Monon, the recognition that their lakes could explode made a return home impossible, at least in the short term. The Cameroonian government declared the immediate area around Lake Nyos uninhabitable, and survivors were moved to resettlement camps in new villages miles away. Life in those resettlement communities was not easy. Many survivors had lost not only family members but also homes, fields, cattle, and the social fabric of their original villages. Camps like Bois were hastily constructed, often lacking adequate infrastructure, schools, or medical services. People wondered how long they would be kept away from their ancestral lands, and whether the promises of government assistance would be kept. Years later, survivors still complained that they had been largely abandoned, with promised compensation and reconstruction projects slow to materialize or never fully delivered. International agencies and scientific teams, meanwhile, focused on making sure Lake Nyos could not spring another deadly surprise. Analyses showed that even after the 1986 eruption, a significant amount of CO2 remained dissolved in the deep water. Without intervention, gas could once again accumulate to dangerous levels over time. Engineers and scientists developed a degassing strategy, installing vertical pipes from the depths of the lake to the surface that would allow gas-rich water to rise and release its CO2 in a controlled, continuous way, instead of in a sudden, catastrophic burst. In the early 2000s, the first such pipes were installed at Lake Nyos, and over the following years more were added, gradually venting gas from the depths. Photographs show columns of water and bubbles shooting into the air from these pipes, like fountains powered by the lake's own internal pressure. A similar system was set up at Lake Manone. By 2019, reports indicated that the degassing project at Nyos had removed a large portion of the dangerous gas, significantly reducing, but not entirely eliminating, the risk of another limnic eruption. Even so, scientists continue to monitor the lake's chemistry and the broader volcanic field, aware that geological systems can change over time. The Lake Nyos disaster also had a lasting impact on science and hazard management. It drew attention to a previously obscure type of natural threat and forced geologists, limnologists, and emergency planners to think about volcanic lakes in new ways. Researchers began examining other deep tropical crater lakes around the world for signs of gas buildup, using sonar, chemical sampling, and modeling to assess their stability. The event also highlighted the need for early warning systems, evacuation plans, and public education in regions where people live near potentially dangerous lakes or volcanic features that do not fit the usual pattern of ash eruptions and lava flows. For the survivors, however, the main legacy has been human rather than scientific. People like Papa Subum still remember the night he woke to find his wife dead on the floor, and his commissioner neighbor's family gone. Men like Yusuf Musa, who was 6 years old at the time, built new lives in resettlement areas, walking kilometers each day to reach schools, and later working whatever land and livestock they could manage. Local organizations such as the Buabua Area Development Association now work to improve conditions in these communities, repairing water systems and advocating for survivors who feel that they have suffered what one leader called a triple jeopardy: the original disaster, years of hardship and resettlement, and more recent violence from regional conflict. Today, if you stand on a ridge above Lake Nyos, the scene looks peaceful again. The water fills the crater in a calm oval, ringed by green hills and occasional patches of cultivated land. There are still no birds flying low over the lake, no livestock drinking from its shore. The immediate perimeter remains largely empty, a ghostly buffer around a place that once sustained life and then took it away. Pipes still rise from the water, a reminder that what lies beneath the surface is being managed, not forgotten. In villages and camps farther away, survivors pass on their memories to children and grandchildren who were born long after 1986, teaching them that the lake they cannot see, tucked away in the hills, is more than just a dot on the map. It is where whole families vanished in a single night of silent gas. The story of Lake Nyos is, in the end, a story of how ordinary life can be upended by an invisible force. It shows that not all natural disasters announce themselves with fire in the sky or roaring rivers of lava. Some come as a whisper, a strange smell, a low rumble, and then a wave of nothing. No oxygen, no sound, just darkness. It is also a story of how science, slowly and painstakingly, can explain even the strangest tragedies, turning mystery into understanding and understanding into practical solutions, like degassing pipes and hazard maps. But for those who survived, and for the families of the roughly 1,700 people who did not, Lake Nyos will always be something more personal, a reminder that the earth beneath their feet and the water in their lakes can hold secrets powerful enough to stop a whole valley's heartbeat in a single night.